Good evening. You're very welcome to this week's episode of Centre Ground. And tonight, the spotlight is on living an authentic life. But first, I'd invite you to go to the Irish Inquiry website, and there's a drop-down box there where you can enter in details of how you can help us with your technical skills, or indeed, if you want to donate a few euro, which will go towards the upkeep of the website and providing the platform. We don't receive any funding, there's no advertising, but it does take a certain amount of money to keep the platform up and running. So any small donation will be most welcome. And so to tonight's programme. Monday was St. Bridget's Day, and we've now entered into the old Celtic festival of Imbolc. And tonight I wanted to do something that, is, I suppose, leaning towards spirituality and the search for an authentic life. And my guest is Dara Molloy, who is a Celtic priest and monk who lives on the Aran Islands. And he's going to chat to me now for the next half hour or so. And then in the second half of the programme, as always, Dr. Peter Kelly will join us. And again, tonight we're going to have a slightly different format. Instead of looking at the hot topic of the week, Peter is going to join Dara and myself in our conversation. So, Dara, you're very, very welcome to Centre Ground, and I want to thank you most sincerely for taking up the invite to be with us this evening.
Thanks very much, Anna. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dara, for people who are not familiar with you, perhaps you might tell us a little bit about your background and what you do.
Well, I've been around a long time now. I'm in my 70s, so I've a long story behind me, and I'll summarise it very briefly. I grew up as a Roman Catholic in Dublin, very taken by the Catholic Church, wanted to serve God in the best way I could, and ended up studying to be a priest. Got ordained as a priest at the age of 27, 28, can't remember exactly. In the Marist Fathers, a religious order in Dublin, who were teaching and also running parishes and retreats. And I ended up getting appointed to teach in a school in Dundalk, in a secondary school. So I was a secondary teacher there for about 6 years. But after I was ordained and appointed to the school, I began to hit a sort of crisis in my life, which was a bit unexpected because my focus had been to become ordained. And then I thought my life would begin. But something to the contrary really happened. My life began to, if you like, stagnate, go sour. And I had the feeling of, in a way, being suffocated spiritually. And I felt this whole way of living that I was in, a big institutional religious organization, a big institutional church, and also teaching in a very institutionalized education system, it was sort of, it just felt I was trapped. And I needed to get out of it, not to leave the priesthood or to leave the spiritual path I was on, but to find a more authentic way to be on that spiritual path. But I couldn't find anything that would attract me. Many of my colleagues were volunteering to go on the missions, and we had very exotic missions in those days. We had islands in the South Pacific, which sounded really beautiful, and a very attractive place to go to. And I knew that I would get a lot of freedom out there, but nothing in me deep inside said, leave Ireland. Whatever I had to do, it seemed, had to be in Ireland if I was to listen to this inner voice. And everywhere in Ireland where people were following a spiritual path was within an institution. So I didn't see any options. But the break came in 1982. I was about 5 years ordained at that time, when I was working with a group of young people in Dundalk, and we decided to go on a camping holiday together in the summer. And just through a series of coincidences, we decided to go to the Aran Islands for our camping holiday. This was long before the Aran Islands were the type of tourist attraction they are now. You know, to get out to the island in August of 1982 we had to arrange a very small boat to take us out with an outboard engine. Like it was very, very primitive, if you like. In fact, the day after we came back after our holiday, that particular boat sank. So we were lucky to get back alive. But that was the island we came to. But we stayed here for 2 weeks. The weather was beautiful. And I just fell in love with the place. And I saw all these monastic remains and all the reminders of monks that had lived here in the past. And I said, sure, that's the way I want to live. I want to be out here in the open air, in the midst of the four elements, and also rooted in my own culture. The people of the island were all speaking the Gaelic language, and they had maintained lots of their ancient traditions, which we certainly hadn't maintained up in Dublin, where I grew up. Just so much of it seemed so attractive. And that's when the penny dropped, if you like, or the veil was removed from my eyes, and I began to see my future. And the challenge then was, of course, to get here, because when you're in a religious order, you're sort of very confined. I had a vow of obedience, which was interpreted at the time as doing what your superiors tell you to do, and so on. But after 2.5 years, I managed to get a break, and I was allowed to come out here for 6 months on an experimental basis. And that was in the beginning of 1985. And once I arrived here, I never looked back. So now, 10 years after that, I stayed here for 10 years as a hermit, living in a little wooden hut beside a thatched cottage. And the thatched cottage I ran as a sort of an open house of hospitality. So people came and went the whole time. And after 10 years of living like that, I decided I didn't want to be part of the church anymore, and I formally left it. And that's when I became, if you like, a Celtic priest and a Celtic monk, which is how you've described me today. So that was 1995. So it's already like 25 years since then that I've been living this life as a Celtic monk and a Celtic priest and a Celtic druid. I sort of have different ways of describing what I do, because I'm drawn not just to the Christian element of the Celtic tradition, but also the pagan element of it, the pre-Christian element, which I think is very powerful also in terms of searching for a spiritual path and for searching for spiritual nourishment in your life. As the festival Imbolc suggests, it's a more ancient festival than the festival of St. Bridget. So you have both the Christian and the pagan there in those two phrases.
Okay, so there's just so much to go back on there. I suppose the thing that I'm really curious about is you living as a hermit for 10 years in a wooden hut. Describe your typical day and what life was like for you.
Well, the wooden hut was a garden shed, literally, that I bought and had to get it sent over to me. It came in sheets, and just each side was a separate sheet, and I put it together myself with some friends, and it was 8 feet by 10 feet, so it was very tiny. And that's where I slept, and that's where I did my own work. And then inside in the house, we had one very small room. It's a very tiny cottage. One of the small rooms we used as a prayer room. And we just put some mats on the floor, and we sat around, and we used to pray every morning for about a half an hour, and every evening for about a half an hour. And we'd sing hymns and read psalms, and we'd share and talk as well. And that became the structure for our day. Then in the rest of the day, we tried to grow our own food. So we grew potatoes and vegetables, and we had chickens and ducks. At one stage, we had goats and sheep. Never got to having cows or horses. We didn't really have the land. We had to borrow any land that we needed for these animals. And I suppose part of the work was people coming and going all the time. So nobody ever stayed with me too long. People came and they might have stayed for one night, or they might have stayed for a week, or some of them might have stayed for a few months. But in the end, they all left. That's the way it was. We're like a little railway station, people coming and going the whole time. So that in a way demanded a lot of my time also, just looking after these people or relating to them or working with them. Not all of them were needy. Some of them were simply young, healthy people who wanted a break to think about their lives and to reorientate themselves. So they used my place for that.
Yes. So then you say then that was your life for about 10 years, and you then decided to make a break with the Roman Catholic Church. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I suppose when you live out on an island, the way I looked at it was I had removed myself from the mainstream. I was out on the very edge of Europe, not alone on the very edge of Ireland. And it's like I was looking at the whole world from a distance, including looking at the church from a distance. And the more I looked at it from that distance, not really being centrally involved in it anymore, although I did say Mass continuously for the local priest, although I didn't have an official role within the parish, but I would help him out. But looking at it from that distance, I just became clearer about the things I didn't like about the church. I didn't like its hierarchy. It didn't seem to me that fitted with what Jesus was talking about. I didn't like its patriarchy. I didn't like how it dealt with women. And so much more I didn't like either. So I think the final straw came when Pope John Paul II, as the Pope was at the time, issued a letter, which I got a copy of, which stated that the church's teaching around the ordination of women was final and was, he called it ex cathedra, in other words, infallible, an infallible teaching, and we were no longer to discuss it, to talk about it off the pulpit, to teach it in our Christian schools and universities. It was just a forbidden subject. And at that point I said, here, what am I doing being the public face of an organisation like that? It was issuing diktats like that to people. That was the final straw for me. It was just it was, there were lots of other reasons, but that was the final straw.
Okay, so you made a break then with Rome, as the fella says, and you embraced Celtic spirituality, which I suppose was going right back to our early Christian roots. How did the form of your spirituality change once you made that break?
That's a very good question, because when I left the Catholic Church, I walked into darkness, in the sense that I had no idea what life was going to be like without the church surrounding me. I'd been born into the church. The church had been my world. I had chosen to get right into the heart of the church. I'd spent a year studying in Rome. I really had immersed myself totally within the church. And here I was stepping outside of that bubble. And I really had no idea, and I certainly had no experience of what it would be like to be outside of the church. And not alone that, but when I stepped out of the church, I said, I'm not leaving my spiritual life, and I'm certainly not leaving my priesthood. I'm still going to work in service of other people in terms of their spiritual life. And people said to me, but you can't do that. You can't be a priest and not have a parish, or you can't be a priest and not have a physical building, or you can't be a priest and not have somebody in authority over you. And I said, well, we're going to see. I'll see how it all works out. I didn't know how it was going to work out. So it all had to manifest itself to me over time. And it did. I just made myself available to people for ceremonies, and people came, not all the time. I mean, I didn't have any money, but gradually people came and asked me for services like a wedding ceremony or a christening ceremony, or later on a naming ceremony for a child, a blessing of the child without it being a christening, vow renewals. And also people came asking me, people in groups came asking me to lead them in a pilgrimage of the holy sites of Inishmore, where I was living, where I still live. So that's the sort of work that began to develop. Then I began to write as well and give talks, and it just all developed slowly, but it took a long time. But now, like, I'm full-time really between writing and performing ceremonies for people in the Celtic tradition. That's really my work now.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about those religious ceremonies and how they differ from the ceremonies in the Roman Catholic tradition, as it were.
Yes, when I'm approached by a couple, let's say, to conduct their marriage ceremony, I don't ask them, do they believe this or do they believe that, or are they practicing this or are they practicing that? I simply take them where they're at, and I say, you're the people in charge of this ceremony, and the ceremony will express your values, and if you have certain beliefs, we'll try to include them in the ceremony as well. So I simply am the facilitator, or the one who provides a service in the true sense of that word. I sort of make a ceremony happen for them that is something they want and that expresses who they are, and that the focus is on them during the ceremony, not on me. So But still, when I'm talking to them and offering them this service, I say to them that what I can bring for them to consider is a lot of ideas from our Celtic spiritual tradition. And often that's why people ask me to perform a ceremony, is because I have that richness of our heritage to offer them. So in a wedding ceremony, they can have the blessing of the man and woman. I can go into these in more detail for you later, but just to give you a summary of it, the blessing of the man and woman, which is for the role as a husband and a wife, and later maybe as a mother and father. The blessing of the 4 elements, which is the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and each of them can represent an aspect of their life. So the earth can be their journey together, the water can be the community that surrounds them, the fire can be their love for each other, the air can be the intimacy of their marriage and all the communication that takes place between them. So they have a ritual of blessing of the 4 elements, and then later they have a blessing with oil for the health of their relationship throughout their marriage, and a blessing of protection of water from a holy well to protect their marriage and protect their future family. So that's part of the ceremony. Of course, they have their vows, they have their rings. They can also tie the knot in the Celtic hand fasting tradition. They can honour their parents. They can remember the dead. All these things can take place within the ceremony as well, and often do.
Right. And just going back on something that you said, that that you embrace the pagan tradition, as it were. Now, the word pagan is not something that I like. I don't like the use of that word myself. That's just a personal thing, because it almost as if the people up until Christianity arrived had no spirituality, and then all of a sudden Christianity arrives and people then find a new form of spirituality. Would I be right in saying that in the pre-Christian period, that the people who lived here in Ireland, perhaps from the Neolithic period, Bronze Age, into the Iron Age, which is the age immediate to the pre-Christian period, that these people had a very rich, deep spirituality and a deep sense of the divine? Would I be right in saying that?
Absolutely, totally right. These people have an awful lot to teach us. In fact, we're the ones that have probably gone wrong, and I can talk about that a bit more if you'd like, because
yes, please do.
I'm even writing a book about it at the moment, how wrong we've gone in our monotheism compared to every other culture in the world before monotheism was polytheistic. In other words, it believed in a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses, a diverse range of gods and goddesses within their own belief system. And the Irish were no different. And we had an undefined number of gods and goddesses in our tradition. Many of them we still remember today, like Breege was originally a goddess before she became a Christian saint. Lu, the god of the sun, gives his name to Lunasa, the month of Lunasa. You have the Isle of Man, that's the god Manannan, who's the god of the sea. We have the rivers, Shannon is a goddess of the river. Boyne, the river Boyne, is a goddess of the river Boyne, and so on. We have so many of them and so many stories about them and their interaction, and they were married and they had offspring themselves and they had relatives and they had a community. All of these things which are not to be found in monotheism. And this is my critique of monotheism today. Like, in a way, I've come a huge distance in my own theology, because of course my theology was monotheistic, and I accepted the idea that there was one God in heaven and he was our Father, and that he had a son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and so on. I've accepted all of that in my earlier life. But when I left Roman Catholicism, I began to question all of my certainties and began to look at it from different perspectives, and especially from the perspective of the Druids and the ancient Irish. And I began to see that in ancient Ireland, people had a sense of the divine everywhere and in everything. And not alone a vague sense of the divine, which you might say some people still have today. They get a lovely sense of the divine out in nature. But these Irish people had different names for the experience of the divine, the different experiences of the divine that they had. So if they experienced the divine in a river, then that was the river goddess they were experiencing. They had a personality for that sense of presence. I don't know if you're familiar with John O'Donoghue's writing, but John O'Donoghue has spoken a lot about having a sense of presence in a place, in a mountain, in a river, in a landscape, wherever. And it's that sense of presence that these early Irish people had too, except that they personified this sense of presence that they found. And you get a different sense of presence, of course, at a mountain than you would at a lake or at a river or at the seaside or somewhere else, a beautiful landscape, whatever. So that's, I think, where all these gods and goddesses come from in our ancient tradition. They're ways of talking about an experience of the divine that you can have in your daily life. And so these people, I believe, have a huge amount to teach us about how to be constantly aware of the divine presence in your life and how to find it and where to find it. And the early Celtic monks, who were the ones who took up that tradition and brought in a Christian layer to it, I think continued to practice that tradition. And I'll talk about more about that, if you like, in a minute.
Well, I suppose what's really coming to my mind is one of the big threats at the moment is the destruction of our environment. You know, the extinction of so many different species. I don't know, I think I read recently that something like 30% of known species will be wiped out in a couple of generations. We have, of course, climate change, pollution, the pollution of water, the pollution of air, and just the general degradation of the environment. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me that it was when we lost that sense of the divine presence in nature and brought God into a church that we built ourselves, as it were, it was then that we began to destroy nature. And I suppose, you know, there's so much talk now about, you know, how we're going to, as it were, protect the environment and protect nature. Perhaps we need to go back and try and connect with that divine presence in nature. Does that make any sense to you?
That makes total sense to me, and it's actually where I'd be coming from myself right now in my life. I'd be connecting the type of belief system that we have in the Western world, which you could call generally monotheism, because it's not just Catholicism, and it's not even just Christianity. You have Islam, and you have Judaism, and you have a number of other big religions who are monotheistic and who trace the origin of the belief in their God back to Abraham and Moses. So it's the Abrahamic monotheism that most of the world now subscribes to. And that's a God removed from the earth. You know, it's the God who's in heaven for all of those religions, not just Christianity or Catholicism. They all think of God as being outside of nature. So once God is removed from nature, you've removed the sense of the sacred from nature and the sense of the divine from nature. And that has left us the opportunity, if you want to call it that, of using nature then as a resource. And that's where all the problems have risen from. That's why we've been so destructive of the environment, because we don't regard it as sacred. And we've been so destructive of other living beings because we don't regard them as sacred either. So this is where the more ancient cultures of the world and the ancient spirituality of the world, including our own Celtic, can teach us so much. And that's where I talk a lot about John O'Donoghue, because he reflects very much where I'm coming from myself. When he was on a committee called the Burren Action Committee, they were trying to protect the small mountain in the Burren called Mullaghmore from having a visitor centre built at its base. And his phrase for describing Mullaghmore was to call it the tabernacle of the Burren. In other words, he gave it a sacred title. And it was through that sense of the sacred that actually his group, the Action Group, were able to protect that mountain from being polluted, if you like, or desecrated, I think he would have said, by a visitor centre with a car park and toilets and everything else that goes with it at the bottom of the hill. And the same thing happened up at Patriarchy, where a mining company were given permission to mine gold at the back of the mountain. And they said, oh, sure, it'll bring jobs to the area and it won't interfere with the pilgrims who come up on the front of the mountain. And just the huge uproar from people who saw the mountain as sacred, and how dare you think of mining it for gold. It's not that sort of a mountain, that eventually the license was removed from them and they didn't go ahead with the mining. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. We need to get back to seeing the land as sacred. We need to get back to seeing the other living beings as sacred as well.
And another thought that's coming to me as you're speaking And it reminded me today, you know, when I was saying Hail Mary, pray for us sinners. It's this whole idea that humans are sinful creatures, and the whole emphasis has been on us as sinful creatures. And I don't know if there's any emphasis placed at all on humans as the divine presence in humans. And if we were cognizant of the fact that the divine is present in humans, that humans are the tabernacle of the divine, as it were, we wouldn't treat each other so badly. We wouldn't treat each other the way that we're treating each other. Maybe I'm gone off.
That's absolutely true. No, you're not gone off at all. You're very much on track there, because that particular type of thinking about sinfulness, humans being sinful, can be traced back to St. Augustine in the late 4th and early 5th century. And where he got his inspiration, if you think about it, was that he was contemplating the God that he believed in, which is the God that Christianity still believes in, and other monotheistic religions as well. That God was in heaven. In the Christian version, he had a son, but that son was born to Mary, a human being, not a goddess, and without the sexual act taking place, and Mary remained a virgin. So in the whole story that is part of the monotheist narrative, there is no activity that in any way relates to sexuality. God doesn't have a sexual partner. God doesn't do the sexual act. He doesn't live in a family. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have a community. And that when theologians began thinking about that, then they could easily extract from that, oh, well, if God doesn't have sex, then sex must be sinful. And I believe that's the root of where this whole notion of sinfulness has come from, in especially the Christian tradition, but in other traditions as well. Like Augustine went on then to, I would say, invent the idea of original sin, where he said that the sin of Adam and Eve was something that we were all infected by, and we all got infected by it at the very moment of conception, when our parents had sexual intercourse. So there again, you're associating sinfulness with sexuality. And so many of the problems in society, even today, are to do with issues around sexuality, gender, abortion, homosexuality, and so on.
And the other issue then is the whole patriarchy and the removal of women from, out of the church, whereas, in the Celtic tradition and in the spiritual tradition predating Christianity, women had an equal role with men.
There again, you can see just how much the theology that you have as part of your culture influences how you think about the life you live. So if you live in a culture which has lots of gods and goddesses, and they all are equal, the men and the women with goddesses, God and goddesses, are equal, which was the case in the Celtic tradition, then on earth we can have equality among men and women as well. Whereas if you have a monotheist belief where there's only a male god and no sign of any female goddess, then that gives the sort of authority, if you like, for men to consider themselves superior to women. And that's, I believe, where the problem of patriarchy has arisen. So how are we going to get rid of that unless we change what we believe? And that's really where I'm coming from today, is that what you believe is not that important, provided people are allowed to believe what they want. So let's have a wide diversity of belief. I think it'll be all the better if we do. It's like, let's have a wide diversity of opinion, and let's listen to each other's opinion. What's important really is how we live our lives, how we behave, how we act towards each other, and the type of society that we create, which is loving and compassionate and just and kind and so on. These are the things that are important. And if you look back at the Celtic monks of the early Christian period, that's how they thought as well. They weren't interested in the theology, the theological rows that were going on in Rome or anywhere else. You never find Irish monks getting involved in those theological discussions at all. And when they do come across the behaviour of the Roman bishops especially, and they're disgusted with their lifestyle and their behaviour, and because they can't see how you could be a Christian and live that way. So it's a completely different perspective.
You know, I suppose many people have left the Catholic Church. We know that actually the new Archbishop of Dublin gave an interview on the Hard Shoulder on Virgin Media, and he was saying that what the future holds for the Catholic Church in Ireland is that many parishes will not have a priest, and so there's going to be, there's going to be huge changes. The bottom line is that so many people have fallen away, people like myself, who would have been a daily mass goer at one time. We've fallen away from the Catholic Church. I myself, in 2016, moved away from it because I felt that by going to mass, I was actually endorsing part of what the church stood for, and I didn't like that. And since then, I have basically found myself not being part of a praying spiritual community. And I listened to a talk recently by Alf Monaghan, and Alf lived in the Middle East and worked as an engineer, I think, for about 25 years. And he has studied the connection between the early Christian church in Ireland and Egypt, where they practiced a different form of Christianity to Rome. It was the Coptic tradition, where the monks went out and the nuns went out into the desert and lived lives of hermits. And it was that tradition then that came to Ireland. And even when they built the monasteries, they didn't seek to live together. Each monk lived, as it were, in his own individual cell, and they may have come together, maybe once or twice a day to pray. But basically, it was a solitary life, living in search of a connection and a deepening relationship with the divine. And that gave me great comfort. And I sort of felt, well, I don't have to be part of a praying community. It's about my search for the divine and developing my relationship with the divine. And I suppose then, in some way, then people that are on the same wavelength as myself, we are connected, as Carl Jung would say, at an unconscious level. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why we have been linked up in the last week. I'd never spoken to you before, but somebody told me about you, and I emailed you, and we're having this conversation tonight. And this is really it is our first conversation, as the fella says. So I suppose in a long roundabout way, what I'm saying is that we need a spirituality for the 21st century that is meaningful for a people of the 21st century. I think what's happening, in some of the churches is that the spirituality that they're offering is a spirituality that was devised for people centuries ago, and it was authentic for people at that time, but it's no longer authentic for people in the 21st century. So I feel maybe that going back to the early Christian spirituality and taking from it what is best and kind of developing it then into a spirituality that is meaningful for people of the 21st century. I'm sorry for being so long-winded, but I hope you get the gist of what I'm trying to say.
I do, absolutely. I think we are at a change point in Ireland particularly, but around the world, in the Western world, we're at a change point where we are moving away from institutionalized religion and more into a more personal, I suppose, individuation is the word that Carl Jung would use, a sort of a personal growth and development, searching for your own particular destiny. And this is something that, first of all, I personally searched for by coming to the Aran Islands and wanting to live like a Celtic monk. And the more I have studied these Celtic monks, the more I understand that personal destiny was absolutely central to their spiritual life. And that's why they all lived in individual huts, so that they sort of recognized that each monk was different and had his or her own destiny. And then they developed certain spiritual practices in order to help them discover that destiny. And one of the major spiritual practices they had was this this practice of what they called wandering, or they called it in Latin peregrinatio. And this was the idea that you sort of put your pack on your back and you headed off, and you weren't really sure where you'd end up. And you were led by, well, if you look at the stories of the Irish saints, when they went on these wanderings, they were led by their intuition, they were led by their dreams, they were led by meeting certain people along the way who directed them on a certain path, and so on. So it was all very much being led, people might say today, by the Spirit. And they had a word for what they were looking for. They were looking for their place of resurrection. And if you look at the stories of the Irish saints, their place of resurrection was the ultimate place that they settled in. In most cases, it was a geographical place. I think it can be more than a geographical place. It could be just maybe a particular way of living or whatever. But in most cases, it was a geographical place. And when they found it, they didn't go any further. There's the great story of Saint Gallen, who now gives his name to the city St. Gallen in Switzerland. And he was traveling across Europe with a group of monks led by St. Columbanus. And Columbanus intended to bring them across the Alps down into the north of Italy. But when they landed in what's now Switzerland and now the city of St. Gallen, when they landed there, St. Gall, which was his name at the time, Gall, he said, "I'm not going any further. This is my place of resurrection." And the others headed on and he stayed there. And that's when the real fruit of his life manifested, because the St. Gallen monastery, which he founded, became one of the best libraries in Europe for housing all the ancient manuscripts, and still is to this day. And of course, the city now is called after him as well. So that's what, 15 or 1600 years after well, about 1500 years since he was alive, and we're still remembering his story and still being inspired by it today. So, you know, there's a lot of inspiration in those stories for young people, especially today, to find who they are. Like, I have 4 children myself that are now young adults. And as every parent knows, your children are each different from each other. And they each have different personalities. They look different, they sound different, and they go on a different path in their life. And parents really cannot predict how their lives will turn out or what path they will follow. They have to find that for themselves. And that's where a strong spirituality that guides them in how to find your destiny, how to find your true deep calling and be true to it, would be a great help to them. And that's where I think the Celtic spiritual tradition can be that great help for them.
Yes, I just love that whole idea of finding what is your true destiny and arriving at that point and feeling happy about it. And I suppose the fruit of these early Christian monks and nuns was that the period that we speak of was the Dark Ages in Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire, when there was no learning and so on. And the monasteries evolved into great centres of learning. So we take St. Finian's Monastery, for example, at Clonard, and the royalty of Europe came to Clonard for their education. And it was a period of unbelievable output. It was, when the high crosses were built, all the wonderful metalwork and croziers and the Ardagh chalice all date to that period. And of course, the wonderful manuscripts like the Kavanagh and the Book of Kells. And there is a book I came across a few years ago by Cahill. I think his first name might be Michael Cahill. Perhaps you might have come across this book yourself. How the Irish Saved Civilization. And basically what he points out in this book is that had the Irish monks and nuns not travelled across Europe and gathered up all of these ancient manuscripts from Greece and Rome and taken them back to Ireland for safekeeping, or taken them to the monasteries that they had established on the continent for safekeeping, they would have been lost, and there would have been a whole period of history that would have been wiped out. And then later on, during the Renaissance, these ancient manuscripts became the basis for the Renaissance, that great period of art and literature that began around the 16th century. So I really feel that today there are very few people living what we call an authentic life. We put children into an education system. We input them when they're about 4 or 5, and we put them through the system, and then they come out the other end at whatever age, some at 18, some at 22, some at 23, and they're guided in a very, very specific direction. But rarely along that journey do we give our young people the space to follow their dreams, to be the people that they want to be, to do what they want to do. Perhaps if they actually said what they wanted to do, they would be immediately put down and said, no, you can't do that. It reminds me a few years ago of meeting this woman, and she was at a crisis. Her son had done his leaving cert, and the expectation was that he would go to college, and he wanted to become a tradesman. And she was happy for her son to do whatever it was that he wanted to do. He had been actually working as a tradesman during the summer holidays, and he was just so happy doing it. But her husband intervened, and he said nobody in our family was ever a tradesman. So the young lad actually then did go and follow his dreams, and he became a tradesman, and he was very happy, but it led to a falling out between him and his father. So I'm sure that story is replicated right across the country, where our young people, how many of them are allowed to follow the life of their dreams, and how many people are actually living an authentic life today and saying, yes, I am doing what I want to do. It's just a question.
No, absolutely. And I would share with you your critique of the education system that we have in the Western world, not just in Ireland, as being one that's sort of modelled on, if you like, a factory which takes in young people as raw material and then processes them the way a factory would up through the curriculum of every year and the curriculum of every subject and the exams at the end of it. It's like, you know, you grade your raw material and you process it and you add value to it, and eventually you put a tag on it and you let it out into the world to be available on the market. We still seem to have that sense of that's the best way to look after our children. And I got a stomach full of it when I was teaching in the first few years of my priesthood. And when I had children of my own, I said, I'm not going to send them to school. And I didn't. And we had 4 kids, and they grew up at home, and we tried to create an environment for them where each of them could develop at their own pace and follow their own interests. And it was interesting because we had 2 twin girls, not identical. And one of them learned to read when she was between 4 and 5. She was very keen to read, and she'd started straight away. And her sister, the twin, didn't learn to read until she was 8 or 9. She was much more interested in art and drawing and creative activity like that. They turned out to be they're both young adults now, and they've turned out to be very different. But just we were able to allow them develop their own pace and follow their own interests. And when they were in their mid-teens, they did decide to go to school. And even though those 2 girls in particular, one of them only spent 2 years at school and the other spent 3, because they went when they wanted to go themselves. And they got amazing results in their leaving certs, despite not having spent all those years in school that other kids had spent. And it makes you wonder, what were all those other kids doing all those years in school if my 2 could get top marks out of an exam after just attending school for 2 years? Like, there's the irony of the whole thing, you know. And my kids, because I think we rear them that way, are very much into following their own path and their own interests, and not allowing a system or an institution or expectations of others to be the defining factor in what they do with their lives.
Okay, now at this stage, I'd very much like to bring in Peter into the conversation. Peter, you've been waiting as always quietly in the wings, and I want to thank you for, you know, every single week in, week out, you make yourself available for Centre Ground, and you just contribute so much to it. So I want to thank you for that, and bring you into the conversation now, Peter. Oh, Peter, Peter, you are muted.
You're muted, yeah.
Yes, Peter is muted. Not at
now
all.
You're right.
Not at all. You're okay.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, Anna, and the privilege is all mine. And you know, the discussion that yourself and Dara have had there has been really fantastic. And you know, I suppose I just wanted to. I'm conscious that you know, we bring on guests every week, and I think I've maybe mentioned this to you on a number of occasions. I'm always very conscious to be, you know, to be, I feel a deep responsibility to our guests to actually listen intently to what they're saying, and to try and maybe, you know, find a thread and kind of join dots, and in some ways maybe to summarize what they say. But that discussion there has been absolutely fascinating and replete with many talking points, and I've made copious notes. I'll try and string a few of my thoughts together, and what I might also try to do is to make it somewhat relevant to maybe what we're going through, and maybe come to maybe some sort of hopeful conclusions. So my apologies. As I say, copious notes there, and again, it's a really rich vein of conversation. The first thing I think that Dara mentioned was this whole concept of institutionalization, and again, it chimes very much with, I think, what we're seeing at the moment, and the perils and the perhaps the evils of institutionalization, because it's often said that you know, institutions can actually be evil in as much as, you know, individuals can be, that institutions can have a certain directionality. Now that can translate into inertia at times, but institutions also develop a culture, and they're imbued with a culture which evolves over time. And I'm just minded of the management guru Peter Drucker, who said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And again, culture is one of those deeply psychological things. It's imbued with, if you will, with a spirit, with those psychological forces. I also really wanted to maybe, you know, if I could sort of elaborate some key words or key concepts, because, you know, words embody concepts. The concept of obedience, and in the context of his role as a Roman Catholic priest, this concept of obedience, and obedience within the confines and the constraints and the frameworks of an institutional dogma, and how that related to fear and fear of consequences. And I think we're actually seeing that now in public administration. I think we're probably seeing that in terms of the medical bureaucracy, and how that's playing out with everything we're seeing. In relation to the education system, again, very cogent points by Dara in relation to education. And, you know, we're really, I think, I do wonder about the quality of our education system when I see, and maybe it isn't a fair comment, but you see the standard of debate on social media platforms. People seem to have lost the art of debate. And I think one of those things, debate is very human. It's a very human activity, and I think to be most effective, you really have to look somebody in the eye, but you really have to be in somebody's physical presence to debate them properly. So I think debates on whether they're on social media platforms or whether they're online, I think we're losing more than a few tricks there, and I think there are inherent weaknesses. But also I think we're moving into an age where, you know, we hear a lot of follow the science. But perhaps people should follow the money rather than the science, because I believe ultimately, the world isn't ruled by scientific considerations. It's ruled by, let's call it the money power, or the finance power, or perhaps the totalitarian logic of capitalism, maybe. But science has to have an underpinning of moral philosophy. So, and I wonder, is bioethics really a viable substitute for that, if you like, that vacuum, that religious vacuum, or maybe a deeper spiritual vacuum that we seem to be emerging into? And I think in the context of maybe some of the weaknesses in the education system, we've science at one point was just a body of knowledge, and now what we've done is we've hyper specialized knowledge rather than looking at things in a sense, in a holistic way. And I think we're losing more than a few beats because of that. A couple of other things that that Dara mentioned, prayer and the importance of prayer. Is it important that we pray more, if for no other reason than to connect to some kind of divine force, something which is greater than humanity, and a recognition that there are forces beyond our control, and that maybe we are not ultimately the ultimate arbiters of our own destiny in some ways. But again, is life too fast? Something that intrigued me greatly when he said he grew his own food, because again, one of my pet topics is really food security, and food security in the country, because we often assume that we have food security and that there's an assumption we can trade our way, a neoliberal assumption that we can trade our way to food security, when in fact very, very few, and increasingly more people, just don't know where food comes from, and maybe don't value food enough. So again, I think that's something that really intrigued me. But I think that the cornerstone of, and maybe the cornerstone is the wrong word, but the key, I think, or the kernel of where we are at the moment in the world, where humanity is this, a disconnection with nature, a disconnection with the natural world. And again, the Catholic Church, have we kind of moved, and again, I'm like you, Anna, I don't like the term paganism, almost in the sense that it's reflected back upon, pre-Christian spirituality, as if it didn't have any merit or it didn't have any intrinsic value in itself, and I think it does. And if I could just give a shout out to Thomas Sheridan. So people should watch Thomas Sheridan's YouTube channel for some really good pointers on that. And I've actually read a lot of Thomas's work, Defeated Demons, Labyrinth of the Psychopath, and also Walpurgis Night. In the latter case, and I think again it's relevant to where we are at the minute, I've had a fascination with Nazi Germany for a long time, for the right reasons, I might add. And the main reason is I always wondered, and having had a German girlfriend even for a period, how Nazism took hold in Germany. And just, if I can be slightly negative for a moment, now I know how, from lived experience. I just want to leave that one there. Also, I think the notion that, morality and human morality, that there was essentially a moral vacuum before Christianity, again, it's a very, it's presumptuous, and it's probably a dangerous presumption to make. People should look at the work of Michael Shermer, the author Michael Shermer, or even Rupert Sheldrake, just to try and answer some of those questions. But again, I think is the core issue, one of the core issues of where we are at the moment, does it relate to humanity's hubris and our notion that we are effectively gods, we are the supreme beings in the universe? And again, I'm just looking at some of the comments, and I think we can find common ground between, if you will, people who have a more spiritual bent, which might not center or gravitate towards Roman Catholicism, and Roman Catholicism itself. And I think there's common ground there, because I think whatever your belief system, I think the common ground we can find is that, there are people who don't have any spirituality, it appears, or any religious beliefs, or even quasi-religious beliefs, and who believe that they are akin to masters of the universe, as it were, or what I think are sometimes referred to as techno-utopianists. And I think they're leading us to a very, very dangerous place, especially with things like the transhumanist agenda. So there's much, and I know I've probably gone on a little bit there, but I'm just wondering, how Dara feels about that issue, really, in terms of living an authentic life. Do techno-utopianists themselves, can we say that they are authentic people, or do they live an authentic life?
Dara, there's a lot to unpack there in what Peter has said.
There's an awful lot there. I couldn't possibly respond to it all, Peter. I just take one thing out of it where you mentioned about science, which is sort of increasing, I suppose, in its voice, insisting on being heard in today's world. For young people growing up, and for people who are searching for an authentic life, science is never really going to answer their deep questions, like, who am I? Why am I here? Why have I been given the parents I've been given? Or why am I growing up in this particular place on this particular historical time? What's life all about? All these deeper questions, which probably science will never answer. And then where do you go to find those answers? And what I have discovered within my own life and within the Celtic tradition in particular, is that if you focus on that, if you focus on your experience of life, the part of the experience of your life which you cannot explain and which science cannot explain, like things like a sense of wonder at seeing a flower bloom, the amazement that you feel when you suddenly realize you yourself and your wife are expecting a new child, and when that child arrives, and around death as well, just the questions we have around death. Science is never going to answer any of those questions, and yet they are very real for people and fundamental for people. And I think that's where spiritual life comes from. Spiritual life is, first of all, allowing yourself to be aware of that side of life, the deeper, more meaningful side of life, and then searching for that meaning and finding a meaning that's right for you, that resonates with you, and that feels like, yeah, this is where I fit in the broader scheme of things. And that's where I believe Celtic spirituality can really help us, because that's what these Celtic monks were all about. They were about sitting on the fence, if you like, between the known world, which they could experience with their senses, and the other world. They called it the other world, which is what's out there beyond us, and which we only get sort of intuitions of, or flavors of, or glimpses of. So we know there's something much greater and much more powerful and much more wonderful out there, but we can't grasp it. But we get little hints of it. And this is where these monks lived. They lived at that interface, if you like, between this world and the other world. And they were very conscious of all of the little intuitions and messages they were getting through that thin veil which separated them from the other world. So that's where I'm at in my life. So I have no negative feelings towards science at all. I think it's wonderful, but I think it has limitations, and it will never answer some of these deeper questions.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, Dara. I mean, I'm just wondering, and again, as a scientist, I'm just wondering, has science, well, first of all, has science been co-opted by powerful forces and vested interests to their ends? Because, I mean, as a scientist, I've seen really arguments and debates have moved, I think, beyond science, and there's a sort of a denial of sort of certain fundamental tenets of science. So that's something that's alarmed me greatly. And I mean, because obviously, I suppose this is where your science and moral philosophy kind of, interact and intersect, in the sense that, science and interpretation of science, really, it has to be girded by and if you will, it has to have a foundation grounded in some sort of moral philosophy. And I just wonder, has that vacuum of whether you any kind of moral philosophy, whether that's coming from a spiritual tradition, call it paganism or call it animism. I'm actually reading a very good book at the moment and I wanted to. I don't know if I could do this. It's not a plug as such, but I'm reading an extremely good book, and it's called Less is More by an author called Jason Hickel. So he traces the, if you will, I suppose the evolution of humanity's kind of connection with nature, really, in the sense that yes, there's a connection with nature in the context of the church, but again, it predates the church, and it was referred to as animism. But indigenous or ancient tribal peoples had an implicit connection with the natural world. They saw themselves as part of the natural world. They didn't see themselves as being in dominion of the natural world or in control, but they were part of it. And I don't think that's necessarily at odds with necessarily with a Roman Catholic view of the world, or a Christian or a monotheistic view of the world necessarily. But they saw themselves, I suppose, as implicitly rooted in the world. And they realized, I think it's very relevant to what we're seeing now, they embraced death. They realized how fundamental and how important death was. They didn't have that, if you will, that techno-utopianist hubris, that this deep desire to defy death. And I think that's being used in the context of what we're seeing at the moment, people's innate fear of death. But I think because of that spiritual or religious disconnection, I think our fear of death has actually increased. I just wonder, is that something, Dara, that you would agree with, that our fear of death probably has increased because of this disconnection from our disconnection from nature and from maybe a more spiritual existence?
I don't know really about that. One of the things that consoles me, and it comes from science, is this idea that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. And if I think of myself as a bundle of energy, an identifiable bundle of energy, then when I die, clearly physically I'm going to be destroyed. It's going to break up apart, and my body will go back into the earth as various elements. But the energy of who I am may somehow continue. In what form or how is beyond me to understand. And I don't mind that, because I'm now so immersed in the Celtic tradition that I want to embrace mystery and wonder, and I don't want to get rid of it. I don't want, in other words, to find answers. I'm happy to find mystery and to live in the mystery. There's something exciting about being mystified, and there's something exciting about experiencing wonder, and, if you like, the magic of life. And that's what these monks were after, and that's, in my older age, it's what I'm after too. And even contemplating scientists, I think most scientists, despite their wonderful discoveries, it's still wonderful, and it's still wonderful to them as well as to you and me. And just the amazing discoveries they're finding, even at a nuclear level, like the more they drill down into what's going on inside even the atoms and the quantums, it just becomes more and more amazing and more mysterious in a way, rather than, so in a way they're solving problems, but it's only opening up more questions, and they haven't found answers to that. So, it's the mystery of life that can be at the heart of somebody's spirituality, and that's what I think Celtic spirituality can offer. Not answers, but mystery.
Oh, if I can say, I completely concur with that. And I exactly the same. I couldn't have said it any better. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. So this notion that obviously your physical being, your physical form, is actually, it no longer exists. But there's something that's beyond that. Some essence, call it infinite consciousness having an experience. But again, if you look at Rupert Sheldrake has dealt with this question, fundamentally, we do not know what consciousness is. Nobody has characterized it. And I think the urge to know is almost it's almost typical of, I suppose, a sort of the narcissism of modern society. This urge to know because we feel that we can know, that we can find out whatever we need to find out, that we can discover what we want to discover, and in fact that there may be certain mysteries that are either not meant to be discovered or that are undiscoverable. So again, there should be, that notion that is exciting, the notion that yes, there are things that, in all of our hubris that maybe we will never know.
Yeah, I love the phrase. Exactly. I love the phrase, the more we know we don't know.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That to me sums it up.
And I think that is actually a very, very good point on which to bring our conversation to a close. And this is just something that has sprung to my mind in the last couple of seconds for people that are watching in and listening. I know that for many people at this time, it is a very, very, very difficult time. We're in the midst of lockdown. People have lost loved ones. People are worried. People are fearful. Some people have lost their businesses. People are struggling. I know that, when you were speaking there about homeschooling your children, and that was wonderful. It was a very, very enjoyable experience for you, Dara. But I do know parents who are struggling to homeschool and trying to work at the same time, work from home or go out to work. It's really, really difficult. Anyhow, Dara, do you think that you might, be able to finish off by bringing words of comfort to people that are watching this evening, that people that are struggling, and perhaps give us a Celtic blessing?
Yes, well, the first thing I'd say is that everything that has a beginning will also have an end. And therefore, we can look forward to the end of this particular trial that we're under. And I think also that whenever we are challenged in our lives, it's a choice that we can make how we deal with that challenge. And I think the only healthy way to deal with the challenge is to see it as an opportunity, even though it's difficult, see it as an opportunity to learn, to grow, to develop, to become wiser, and maybe just to reflect on our lives and to readjust. So hopefully we will all come out of this challenging time wiser. We will have clarified our values. We will have grown as human beings. We'll have hopefully put higher on the priority list the importance of kindness and compassion and generosity and patience. So finish with some sort of a Celtic blessing. May the earth beneath your feet give you a sense of solid ground in your life, and may that sense of being supported never leave you in the course of your journey forward in life. May the water surrounding you remind you of all the people who surround you and love you and who are there for you and who are only too willing to reach out a helping hand if they see that you are in need or willing to receive them. May the close relationships that you have, the people that you love most in your life, may they continue to nourish you and support you, just like the air you breathe in and out. And may the fire of the sun, the fire that the sun represents, keep alive in you the fire of love, which at the very end of the day is the most important of all. Faith, hope and love, but the most important of these is love. So, and with that, may you go out tonight with the blessing of Bridget, with the hope and anticipation of the springtime, and with looking forward to better times to come.
I want to thank you so much, Dara, for being my guest this evening. It has been, really, really wonderful and very enlightening, very inspiring and very encouraging. And hopefully it will get people to think about, where they are on their journey in life. Everybody is at a different stage of their journey. and maybe, I suppose, hopefully people will be inspired to go on a journey to find their true self and what it is that they are meant to be and who they're meant to be. And as always, I want to thank Peter. Peter, you bring so much to the discussion every week, and your assessment and your evaluations and all of that, just so rich, and I want to thank you for that. To you, our viewers who have been listening in, I want to thank you so much. And in this, the Celtic Feast of Imbolc, I pray that you have a wonderful week ahead. Bannocht de Orif Galer.